How to use leave policies in UpRaise. This feature is available in UpRaise for Employee Garrison and UpRaise People apps for Jira. On my screen here, I've already navigated to the leaves or time off screen. In there, I'm opening up the Manage tab. Of course, the access to this Manage tab is restricted only to users who have the necessary permissions to manage the leaves related stuff. Here, let's understand what time off policies are. Every organization has its own distinct needs to cater to their employees for leave management purposes. For example, an organization in India might be compelled to allot, let's say, 15 casual leaves per year to all of their employees. However, let's say within a different geography, maybe in Europe, it's mandatory by regulations for employees to have a minimum of 20 casual leaves along with 5 community leaves. You can imagine where I'm going with this. All of these configurations, whether the definition of leave types, the number of leave types, what kind of accrual happens, what is the number that gets carried over into the next year, all of that is configured under the time off policy or leave policy. Now what I'll do is, on my screen here, you'll notice there is a default leave policy, and on the right extreme, I see the ability to add a new policy along with the section that tells me there are 3 users in my company directory who are not associated with any leave policy at the moment. Let me click on add new. This is where you add the details of the leave policy that you're creating. Maybe call it, let's say, EU leave policy. I can add the description. This leave policy, this is not going to be visible to everyone. It's only for your own references. This leave policy is applicable to all users from our EU offices. An important element of this leave policy is the renewal date. You'll notice right now it is set to 1st January by default. What will happen is this renewal date will be the date on which system will sort of run through all the annual calculations with regards to this leave policy. What those annual calculations are, we'll talk about it again towards the end of the video once we have talked about the types. But here you can go in and change this date. In our case, for example, in India, the financial year starts from 1st of April. That is why, in case of our office policies, the renewal date is 1st of April. I'll click on save and next, and then I will be brought to the page where I can define different types for this leave policy. Let's say I want to add a casual leave. Here, you'll notice there are a bunch of configurations. We'll go through these configurations one by one. You add the type of leave, right? Casual leave, maternity leave, I don't know, community service leave, whatever makes sense for your situation, you name the leave type accordingly. The next configuration that you have to choose here is accrual. That is where the user allocation of corresponding leave type is defined. When you Click on this drop down. There are four options: annual, semi-annual, quarterly, monthly. And then you define the number of days. Imagine this community service leave needs to be accrued annually in 20 numbers, meaning at the beginning of the year, on the renewal date for this policy, users who are associated with this leave policy will get 20 community service leaves, right? If I change this to semi-annual, then they'll receive that allocation accrual every 6 months. I can change this depending on whatever my needs are. So you can allocate one monthly leave as well, or maybe what you have a different policy in place where the casual leaves are allocated based on the time employees are spending at your organization, maybe 2.750. I'm just taking an example here. And you'll notice that is what the description says, the hint text says. These many leaves will be accrued for this type at the beginning of each accrual period. So every month, the associated employees will get 2.750 leaves of casual type allocated, credited into their balance. Do you want this round off to nearest 0.0? You can set it to no if that is not required. What this will do is, if you set it to yes, what that will mean, 2.75 will automatically turn to 3 because you're rounding it off to the nearest 0.5. Majority of the times it's not needed if you are accruing with too many decimal numbers. Pro rata, it determines whether the accrual number is dependent on users' association with that policy. Imagine I'm allocating 20 leaves annually to any user at the beginning of the year. But what if a user joins exactly midway through the year? Should they also get 20 or should they be accruing only 10? If you set that to yes, then that means the calculation will happen based on when the user was added to the policy, right? Next, you've got carryover in days per year. So how many leaves from this leave type do you want to carry over into the next year? Now, this is an important configuration which tells you, imagine your employees are accruing 20 leaves per annum of casual time. But imagine only 10 of them were utilized by John, who was associated with this leave policy. Now, what should happen to those 10 remaining balance casual leaves is dictated by this carryover. If your carryover configuration is 5 days per year, then that will mean that John's, out of the 10 balance that John had, 5 will be carried over into the next cycle. So in the next year, John will get these 5 plus the new 20 that will come in. So John will have a balance of 25. And the remaining 5 will get lapsed. They won't be utilized. Similarly, let's say if you had this carryover set to 50, what that will mean, at any given point in time, users will be able to carry over up to 50 leaves of casual leave type into the next cycle. Anything more than that, that gets lapsed. Next, you've got the maximum balance. By default, this configuration is disabled, but what it does is it allows you to limit the balance on this leave type, right? Imagine this is, let's say, a community leave, community service, right? That's the right name. And it is accrued monthly. One leave is accrued every month for community service. Now, if you do not want these leaves to exceed, let's say, 3 at any given point in time, you can utilize this maximum balance feature. What will happen is every month at the beginning of the month, this one leave will get accrued to John, who is associated with this leave policy. And maybe in the third month, he will have accrued 3 community service leaves. If he has not used any of those existing leaves, then that balance will continue to increase. It will go to 4, 5, 6, and so on in the subsequent months. But what if you do not want any employee to take more than 3 community service leaves at any point in time? So what you do is you turn on this feature and you say at any point in time, the maximum balance for this community service leave type should be 3. Even if the accrual happens due to the maximum balance feature, balance of John with regards to this community service leave type will not exceed 3. Then you've got the negative balance. Do you want this to be allowed or not allowed? What happens is if you set it to not allowed, that will mean when the user is applying for this type of leave, system will not allow the user to create this leave request if their balance is going to become negative after that leave request. If you set it to allowed, users, employees will be able to create those leave requests, and the prerogative of accepting or rejecting that leave request lies with the relevant authorities. Finally, you have the payment, whether it's just an indication of paid or unpaid leave types. This is useful for your payroll purposes where you export the leave related data and then you pick up the color code that's associated with this leave policy, or rather leave type. Tempo internal issue is part of the Tempo timesheets integration. We'll talk about it in a separate video. But this is what the leave type configuration looks like. Thirdly, I won't add the leave type. Thirdly, you've got the employees tab where you associate different employees with the policy that you have created. Let me do one thing. Let me go back to the time of policies main page and I'll go to the default leave policies. In here, you'll notice there are multiple different leave types. There is leave without pay, there is casual leaves, there were sick leaves, there were sabbatical leaves, there was even work from home leaves, which are now disabled because we don't use them anymore. Right? So that's how the configuration looks like. In our case, for casual leaves, if I click on edit, you'll notice annually 22 leaves are accrued. These are rounded off to nearest 0.5 and the pro rata is set to yes and carryover is 0, meaning nothing of this balance is carried over into the next year. Negative balance is not allowed and this is a paid type of leave, right? In the third tab, like I said, you define the employees. If this is set to be the default policy, that will mean every new user that is added to the UpRaise company directory gets automatically associated with this leave policy. Similar to the holiday schemes discussion we have had in a separate video, whenever a new user is added to this leave policy, their enrollment date, or rather the date on which they were added to this leave policy, will be displayed as the enrollment start date in here. You can always remove the user and accordingly the configuration changes. First and foremost, the important part, imagine this leave policy is already existing and now I come in and change something. Let's say I changed this number from 22 to 20 and saved. Keep in mind that this will not impact the accruals that have already happened in the past. This will only impact the accruals that will happen in the future. So some of these configurations are dependent on when the user was added to this leave policy and some of the others are not. For example, imagine if someone had joined in the mid of the year, and since at that point in time, this pro rata setting was set to yes, they would have accrued only 11 of these 22 leaves that are accrued because they joined in the mid of the year. But you changed the policy and then you said, I don't want this to be pro rata. Everyone should get the same 22 leaves accrued irrespective of when they become part of this policy. Like I said, this will not impact all the existing accruals. This will only have an influence on the new assignments, new associations with the policy. Let me click on cancel and see what else I want to cover in here. Similar to what we have done, you can disable some of the leaves that you don't want to use it anymore. For example, in our case, before COVID, we allowed a certain number of days work from home policy. Now that's not required because we have become a fully remote organization. So we have disabled that leave type fully. What else do I want to cover here? Right. So the renewal part. Now, what will happen on the 1st of April? If we go to the types, firstly, the accrual will happen. Whatever is set to annual, that accrual will happen on the renewal date. Then the carryover logic will be executed at that point in time. So if a certain leave type is supposed to be carried over, maybe five of those leave types are supposed to be carried over into the next cycle, that calculation will happen on the renewal date. So these are the important things that happen on the renewal date. And obviously, all the credits, debits are visible for each one of the users separately. We'll talk about that in a different video, but I hope this detailed explanation around leave policies is helpful for you. Thank you.